You're pro now, right?
We're con, so Con is speaking first.
Oh, con.
And you guys are from
Cupertino. Judges ready?
I am.
I am.
So time begins now. We are proud to negate the resolution. We offer a few observations to clarify the ground. First, ought indicates a moral responsibility, but more importantly, an element of feasibility. According to Graysick of MNS8, many philosophers use the principle, quote, ought implies can, as a basic test of moral obligation. We should not blame people for failing to do what they cannot possibly do. Thus, feasibility and practicality are prerequisites. Second, it would be immoral for the government, which engages in a social contract with the people, to take measures that would likely harm more than help. In this sense, if we prove to you that reparations are either infeasible or harmful, it would be immoral for the U.S. federal government to take such measures at the expense of millions of people. Finally, the word pay indicates an exchange of money. It does not stand that I can, for instance, repay a group by broadly applying an urban repair program to a given city. Contention 1. The debt has been cleared. The most important reason that reparations are not morally required in September of 2015 is that they have already been paid. Says Professor David Tucker in August of 2000, quote, the debt has already been repaid. Affirmative action programs have been in place for over 30 years. They're very expensive. Federal, state, and local governments spend money administering and enforcing them. It is clear that payments of tens of billions of dollars annually have been made to Black Americans for decades. Regardless of whether or not we owe blacks for crimes against them, it is clear that we've already done our part to pay them back. Contention 2, reparations would be harmful. There are a few ways in which reparations would actually do more harm than good. First, the wrong Americans will be financially burdened. There are nearly 42 million immigrants in the United States, many of whose ancestors were not even around to perpetuate slavery. Says Alfred Brophy in 2004, quote, the sad truth is that payments will have to come from taxpayers, who have no culpability for the past crimes and little, if any, of the benefit. Second, reparations perpetuate racism by allowing people to pretend the harms of slavery have been cleared. Art Hall of St. Mary's in 2013 writes that, quote, an illusion of general racial harmony is created. Although the negative racial sentiments and power structure generating the original injustice remains intact. Reparations further the huge racial issue in our country. Third, the lottery effect takes control. Says Kyle Smith of Forbes in 2014, reparations would work a lot like lotteries. A survey of Florida lottery winners shows that this group is twice as likely to go bankrupt as others. A lump sum payment could actually result in an absolute decline in black income. Giving reparations would only likely further bury blacks in economic hardships. Finally, reparations would be counterproductive to solving inequality issues. By paying weak and ineffective reparations now, the government essentially absolves itself from the responsibility of bettering black lives. Says John Carlyle, slave reparations would weaken any national effort to eradicate poverty among blacks. It will undermine the claim for further help down the road because the rest of America will say, you've been paid. Law professor Eric Yamamoto furthers by saying that it became impossible for Japanese Americans to sue for reparation purposes after nationwide reparations were passed. Contention 3, effective reparations are infeasible. The payment of reparations is impossible in two ways. First, it would never be practical for the U.S. to monetarily pay reparations. Studies have found that to adequately pay reparations, the U.S. would have to pay $11 trillion. Given that the U.S. national debt does not even stand that high, it is unreasonable to assume that we would ever be able to pay that back. Second, reparations would never be possible. As stated by columnists Boychuk and Mathis in 2014, reparations are politically impossible. A political and legal effort to make reparations a reality gained momentum in the late 1960s and again in the 1990s and the early part of the last decade before falling to pieces. With a gridlocked Congress that can't even agree on the simplest issues, there is no way reparations would be passed by the U.S. federal government. Political backlash would destroy the peace existing currently within our nation, undermining any chance for reparations to work and harming many more people than reparations would even slightly benefit. For all of these reasons, we are proud to negate.
We're going to take some time. You will tell you when to start your time, so you need to time each other, right?
Sorry?
We're going to keep time from each other for each other. Yeah, so.
oh, with the prep, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to start now.
Alright, that's 40 seconds.
Everybody's ready?
Let's go to Perthy for the pro.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anshul and I affirm today's topic resolved the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. All the affirmative must prove to win this debate is that a government obligation to repair past wrongs exists. Solvency is not a requirement. The job of the affirmative is not to ensure equality, but rather to ensure equal opportunity for blacks in America. Contention 1 is genocide. Rodney Coates from Miami University finds that since our nation's official beginning, there have been horrors of rape, kidnap, and murder upon 12 to 15 million African Americans, more than double the amount killed in the Holocaust. Alan Cooper from Otterbein University finds that the Genocide Convention and other declarations of international law provide a legal basis for a justification of reparations to African Americans. In actuality, international law compels the United States to act on these past injustices. As Anthony Gifford noted, international law recognizes that those who commit crimes against humanity must make reparations as defined by the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1928. Rather than calculating the personal losses for any given individual, the understanding under international law is that the victim of a genocide is any individual identified as a member of the target community, which is in this case African American citizens of the United States. Under the Genocide Convention, the UN Geneva Convention, and numerous other international bodies, the United States federal government has a legal obligation to pay reparations. Because we ought to follow laws, we ought to pay reparations. Contention 2 is employment discrimination. The federal government has laws protecting against discrimination against gender, sexuality, and ethnicity, but have never regulated against discrimination against the unemployed. Because discrimination against the jobless is not illegal, the federal government does not track such data. This provides a loophole for corporations to make it harder for African Americans to find a job than whites. Researchers at the Poverty Action Lab submitted identical resumes for more than 1,300 job openings, giving each applicant either a distinctly white-sounding name or a distinctly black-sounding name. Resumes with black-sounding names were 50% less likely than those white-sounding names to receive callbacks. Overall, the Harvard Law Review calculates that in 1 year in the 1970s, employment discrimination cost blacks $123 billion. Extending the data into present day, the study finds that African Americans have lost more than $4 trillion due to employment discrimination. Fortunately, a direct cash transfer program can combat employment discrimination. The benefits are twofold. First, economic benefits to blacks. James Riccio from the National Poverty Center Policy Brief found that direct cash transfer programs have been an immense success, lowering poverty by 11%, increasing the likelihood that parents have a bank account by 22%, and increasing income by 14%. The second impact is educating African Americans. Anna Iser from Brown University finds that cash transfers increase the average schooling by 0.4 years. Contention 3 is housing discrimination. Blacks have faced housing discrimination since the inception of the Federal Housing Administration. Mark Seidel from the Journal of Land Use finds that the FHA placed black communities in the highest risk category and then redirected mortgage funds and loans away from the black community towards middle and high-income white families. For this reason, Adolphus Pruitt from the St. Louis American calculates that blacks are 2.4 times more likely to be denied a mortgage than a white. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, between 2000 and 2004, there was an average of 1.6 million acts of rental discrimination against African Americans each year. Robert Wesley from the Third World Law Journal estimates that the current generation of blacks will lose about $82 billion in equity due to institutional discrimination. Even worse, however, the next generation of blacks will lose $93 billion. However, housing integration programs that redirect loans to African Americans will put blacks and whites on equal field. The benefits are twofold. First, an increase in the quality of life. The Department of Housing and Urban Development finds that 84% of blacks in social mobility programs felt that their quality of life had improved. Residents in the mobility plan had a 57% unemployment rate compared to the 24% rate from those without the mobility plan. The second benefit of integration programs is decreasing racial resentment. The Frameworks Institute finds that when whites are exposed to the stakeholder effect, which is when blacks are given stake in richer communities such as owning homes near whites, racial resentment overall is reduced by 4%. For those reasons, I urge an affirmative ballot. Right, we're going to take like 10 seconds.
This first speaker may have the first question. Are you an immoral person?
Yeah.
So if I tell you that you're an immoral person because you are not solving world poverty, is that fair?
No.
So if you're telling me that the U.S. federal government ought to pay reparations, even though they just cannot, and it is not feasible, is that fair?
Let me go back to that.
No, could you answer the yes or no?
It would be immoral for me not to try to solve poverty if I said all the people
So
in poverty
you're telling
could go
me
screw
that all
themselves.
that
Would be a
needs,
bad
so
thing.
you're telling me that all that needs to happen is the U.S. federal government needs to try.
Yeah,
Correct?
exactly.
So,
Alright, so let me
in
ask you
our
a question.
first-
Wait, actually, let me ask you a question about that. It's really close to that. In your first argument, you say that the debt is cleared, right?
Yes.
That means we've already paid reparations.
Yeah, so let me
So
explain
wait,
that actually.
that's not, I haven't asked the question yet. So your second argument, you said there are all these harms if we pay reparations.
Mhm.
If we have already paid reparations, have we seen any of the harms you listed in your second argument?
No, what we're telling you is that
Why?
the debt has been cleared. This is not the form of reparations that you were speaking about in your
Okay,
case.
you talked about direct cash transfers and
We're actually not talking about direct cash
Okay, what
transfers.
type
We're
of
talking about
reparations?
affirmative action programs. These are programs designed to help African Americans
Okay,
improve their
so they give them,
situation.
affirmative action gives African American scholarships, right?
Not only that, we can bring that up later.
Okay,
But let me
doesn't
explain
that
this to you.
count
Can I
as
answer?
cash
Can I
transfers?
answer your question?
Yeah, sure.
So the affirmative action programs are aimed at improving the situation of the Black Americans. And what we're telling you is that you just conceded that all we have to do is make an effort to solve the harm that we caused in the
It would be immoral
past.
to not
And
try.
we have, yes, exactly, and we've spent
Yeah.
tens of billions of dollars already, meaning we have tried. So according to your own definition of this resolution, we have tried, meaning we're done.
Yeah,
we don't need to
so
pay
let's
it.
go back to that. The next contradiction in your case comes in your third argument where you say that reparations are not practical. If we have already paid reparations, how can you say that it's
We
not
did
practical?
not say that we have already paid
That was
reparations.
your
If you
first
read the
argument.
first contention tagline, it says that the debt has been cleared.
Is that not a reparation?
No, that is not a reparation.
Why?
Because that doesn't align by our definition or your definition of reparations. Your definition of reparations is direct cash transfers. You
We
cannot,
also talked about social mobility programs.
but
like
you did
giving
not
people
define
loans.
reparations as social
And I'm telling
mobility.
you now, right?
But it must have been in your first case.
It
Anyways, can
wasn't
I have
that
another
case. I'm
question?
sorry.
Can I have
Second.
another question?
Yeah, go for it.
So where are you going to get the money from to pay reparations?
I don't know. Like, we're not advocating
You
a plan
don't
because that's
know?
against the rules in public
Okay,
forum. But like, you guys assume
It's not a
that.
plan. It's that just
Yeah,
common
sure, okay,
sense
so let
means
me-
that when you pay
so let me give
reparations.
you an
No,
advocacy.
there's a
Let-
question. Where is the money going to
Yeah,
come
that's what I'm saying, right?
Okay.
It doesn't have to come from taxpayers. The United States
So
government already spends, like you said, tens of billions of dollars to try and like fight this like racial
And that
discrimination.
money
right?
comes
that
from
money,
taxpayers.
That money can be redirected
So-
towards
So
reparations,
basically,
right?
you're
It doesn't
telling me
have
that
to be
you're
new
going to
taxes.
take money away from the things that taxpayers have paid for them to go to and put it somewhere else. Meaning
You
that
said they don't
taxpayers
work, so why
are
don't we try
either
it?
directly or indirectly paying for these reparations,
Okay, so
correct?
so you guys, there's
So
no.
you just conceded that taxpayers
Okay,
are either
yes.
directly or indirectly
So
paying
let me
for
answer your
reparations.
question, right? We're not adding taxes to taxpayers. We're redirecting the money
But
from
it
the
doesn't
programs.
matter.
You say- let me
Exactly,
finish.
so you're
Wait, let me
redirecting-
finish.
okay.
You didn't let me finish, right? We're directing money from the programs that you say don't work into a program that will work. We're
We
not
did not
adding
say
new
that they
taxes.
did not work.
That
In
was
fact, we said that the debt has been cleared.
So
We
you're
did not
saying
in
there's no
any way.
racism now?
No, that's not. But you just said that we're not. You
That
guys
means
are
the
not
programs
advocating
haven't
for
worked.
solvency. You're not advocating for solvency.
Alright, we're gonna take a little break. I got this last second. Yes.
Alright, so I'm just going to touch real quick on this debt cleared point, then we'll go right down their case, starting with the observations and the contentions. Everyone ready? Good. Alright, let's start off with this idea of the debt being cleared. We're not saying affirmative action is a reparation. In fact, we're saying it's not a reparation at all. But it is clearing the moral debt. That's what we're trying to say. They're saying we have a moral debt because of genocide, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, crimes we committed against African Americans. We're saying we've taken measures to try to alleviate that. Sure, it hasn't worked 100%, but they're not even talking about whether their programs will work. They don't even talk about the real world. They just talk about morality. We're saying that we've already cleared that moral debt. That's why we went on morality. Let's talk about their first observation. They say, They just have to prove a government obligation. They don't need to prove solvency at all. First, I'd like to point out that the obligation of the United States is to benefit the most of its citizens in any way that it can. If by enacting reparations to African Americans it's actually harming other groups of American citizens, it would be completely immoral for the United States to do this. They would have an obligation not to pay reparations. And second, let's look to our definition of ought. They don't offer a different one. Ought means that we have to include this element of feasibility. I cannot hold someone to a moral standard in which they cannot comply. I cannot say, you were an immoral person because you didn't solve world poverty, right? You couldn't have solved world poverty. It's not fair to hold the U.S. government to a moral standard that it cannot possibly follow through with. That's why you're going to look to this idea of ought, and therefore, there is solvency. We have to look to solvency. We have to look to the real world. Then I'd like to point out they don't find reparations, and they only talk about, in their case, this idea of direct cash transfers, meaning they are agreeing to our definition of lump sums. This is going to be very important when we get into the lottery effect and other kinds of effects like that. So let's talk about their first contention. They talk about how there's genocide, we've committed all these crimes against blacks in the past, international law creates this problem, and we're culpable and we have to follow through. There's a couple of responses. First, current taxpayers are not actually culpable for this harm. Current taxpayers were not the people that caused genocide. Current taxpayers were not the people that even necessarily had ancestors that caused the genocide. Remember, 42 million immigrants are in this country who didn't have ancestors at all at the time of slavery or in the time of segregation. They should not have to be financially burdened to solve a problem that people 100 years ago caused. That's not fair. And second, with this point of international law, we break international law a lot. It's not like it's a super binding thing. There's not going to be any serious effect. They didn't really quantify why this is going to harm the United States. And remember, the USFG only has an obligation to benefit its citizens, not to look to international law when it harms its citizens. So their second point, they talk about discrimination. They basically say they're going to send these cash transfers, $4 trillion, something like that. But remember, they're agreeing to this direct cash transfer point, which means they are buying into our lottery effect point. This doesn't just apply to blacks, this applies to anybody. When we send money just directly to people, when you just give people money all of a sudden, it doesn't work. People don't know how to spend it, they don't know how to invest it, they're going to lose it. In fact, we've seen our evidence in our second contention tells you it's actually going to often make poverty worse for these people. And then a audit in 2008 tells us that they're simply not effective when done in the past. Paying people a lot of money, as they advocate for, is not actually going to work. It's not going to solve any of these problems. And then they talk about housing discrimination. I want to key on something he said in the last crossfire. He said, we're going to be diverting money away from programs that are actually going to, that don't work, and send them into these programs. The problem with this is that when you divert money away from programs that are in place now, you're taking away from other groups. You're causing the very kind of discrimination that you're trying to stop, and that's going to be really important. Let's talk about this idea, in my case, of perpetuating racism and counterproductivity. Basically, what happens is when you take money and take it away from some group, giving it to another, or take it away from the taxpayers, giving it to African Americans, you're targeting African Americans specifically. That's discrimination. You're not benefiting all the minorities. There's a lot of minorities in the United States that the USFG has harmed. By giving it simply to African Americans, you're not solving that problem. In fact, you're creating the very problem that you try to stop. You're creating more discrimination. And then second, there's a really important point I want to bring up. My last subpoint in my second contention, which is this idea of counterproductivity. The government absolves itself from solving these problems in the future, right? Housing discrimination is one reason that people might want the reparations, but simply providing a remedy for housing discrimination doesn't mean blacks are going to be done. They are going to want more, but when we pay them for these housing discrimination or things like that, they can't get more. The government says, you've been paid already, we don't need to solve your problem, you're precluding any future repair for African Americans, that's why you vote nay.
Alright, yeah, we'll take a little bit of pressure. That was 20 seconds, so we have 50 left. Are all the judges ready? Alright, time begins now. Let's look at the top of my opponent's
case with a framework. Now they say ought is responsibility and feasibility. That's simply not true. If I'm walking next to a lake and I see a drowning baby, but I'm disabled, I have a moral obligation to preserve life and save the baby, even if I can't. The obligation exists, the feasibility doesn't. Remember, this resolution just says, do we have an obligation to do it? Not can we do it and stuff like that. We just need to look if the obligation exists. We don't need to look at the feasibility. The government has an obligation to try to help its people, and if we can prove that, we will win this debate. Now they define pay as money, and they say we're only advocating for direct cash transfers. That's not true. Look to our third argument. They don't even respond to the social mobility program benefits. That's going to be a reason you're voting for us, because we're upholding their burden. We're benefiting African Americans in the housing market because unemployment increases 33%. You extend that across the globe, that's going to be key in this debate. Now go to their first argument about debt cleared. A number of responses here. First, it contradicts their third argument. Remember, they say the debt is cleared because we paid this affirmative action. Remember, that means we can just redirect this money from affirmative action to this reparation. Now they can see that affirmative action hasn't worked. It hasn't been effective. If we can just redirect money from affirmative action into these reparations, then we solve for feasibility. We're just redirecting taxes. We're not increasing taxes. So they're not going to be gaining offense there. But second, they say that after 2000, when we did affirmative action, that this debt has been cleared, right? But still today, the 14th Amendment and the Free Fair Housing Act has not been enforced. In fact, from 2000 to 2004, there were 1.6 million acts of housing discrimination against African Americans. But more importantly, the current generation loses $82 billion, and the future generation loses $93 billion. This is really important because the government hasn't solved the moral debt at all if there's still numerous acts of discrimination violating the 13th Amendment. Now next, the third response is that affirmative action doesn't work, right? We redirect money to reparations that will be effective. Now we haven't done reparations in the past like they said. Reparations will be effective in the United States based on historical examples in other countries, and that's what Ani and I are going to be telling you. Now, their second argument is about the harms, right? First, in cross-examination, they say none of these harms have happened today because of affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy to benefit African Americans, and if we're not seeing any of these problems that they outline in their second argument here, there's not going to be any of those harms if we pay reparations. But now, into their three specific warrants. First, they say we're benefiting the wrong Americans, and they cite these 42 million immigrants. Two things. First, 42 million is not holistic of the United States. That's not that big of an impact. But second, discrimination benefits everybody, not only the white people, or not only the people that perpetuated slavery. Everybody in society benefits from discrimination because they get a leg up. For example, two people applying for a job, if you're white, you're going to get the benefit. That's an unfair advantage. Even if they didn't cause slavery, they still benefit from discrimination. But second, they're talking about perpetuating racism. Historical examples disprove this. After the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, you saw a number of policies that were passed to benefit African Americans, most notably the Fair Housing Act and others such that said you can't discriminate against African Americans. But more importantly, you can break the cycle of complacency by voting for the affirmative. Recognize that if you vote for the affirmative, you're instigating discourse, you're decreasing racial resentment by 4% by creating the discussion of African Americans' reparations. Third, they talk about lottery. Recognize that direct cash transfers decrease poverty by 11%. This is an empirical study. They just said it's similar to lottery, and people who win the lottery do bad in Florida or something. Recognize that based on direct cash transfers in the past, it increased income by 24%. But also, we're not only talking about direct cash transfers. We're talking about social mobility that increases unemployment by 33%. But third, they talk about infeasibility. First, we've already paid it according to them. We've already been benefiting African Americans through affirmative action. But second, we wouldn't have to pay $11 trillion. We just have to pay money to make the discourse there, so in the future we can pass more reparations. Remember, we don't need to pay all $11 trillion. It's simply infeasible. But third, remember, we're not adding taxes. We're redirecting taxes. And feasibility doesn't even matter in this debate. It's just obligation. Do we need to try to fix racism? And that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Okay. All right. As first speaker, can I ask the first question?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So, would you say that governments are people?
They're controlled by people.
Right, but would you say a government is the same as a person?
Not necessarily.
No, right? So then, don't you think that governments should be held to a little bit different moral standard than an individual?
No, I think they should have the moral obligation to benefit their people.
Right.
Like, they have a moral obligation to try, even if it's not feasible, even if they can't. Like, for example,
No,
if a
but
corporate,
in the process...
Listen.
Okay.
Let me give an
analogy, right? If I'm working for a corporation and a corporation has promised me a pension, but this corporation is on the verge of bankruptcy, they still have an obligation to pay me the pension,
Right.
even if they're not, even if it's going to hurt them, and even if they're not able to. The
Right,
moral
but see, the
obligation still exists.
analogy falls there because in the case of the USFG, it would be like giving you the pension to take away from 10 other people. We're
No,
telling
that's
you
not- okay,
overall
listen.
there's going to be harm to the
Listen,
rest of
you're-
America.
you're
Would you
ignoring-
agree, would you concede that if there's a net moral harm, that means it's
Okay,
immoral for the
first of all-
USFG to do that?
Alright, two things. How would you be harming other people? And
We're
second,
burdening the wrong people, we're causing
So it's
public
by taxes,
discrimination.
right?
In fact, we're actually even harming
listen,
black
this
people's
is- let's-
chances to
let's-
get reparations in the future. We preclude
Okay.
future repair.
Alright,
Yamamoto
that's
tells
not
you
exactly
that
true.
happens in the case of Japanese Americans.
alright, is there a lot of racism against Japanese Americans right now?
No, but the
Okay,
pro-
so
no,
see,
that's not the
the
argument I'm
reparations
making. That's not the argument I'm making. I'm making the argument that
No,
it
but like the
precludes
most
the
important
future repair.
impact-
When the
listen.
Japanese Americans
Alright, you're
were
not letting me talk here.
Alright, I'm sorry about
Alright, so let's get back to my initial question,
Sure.
right? About like how it would harm other people. You guys are specifically talking about like these immigrants that would have to pay taxes, right? Right now, discrimination exists in the United States. Like right now, there's corporations and the government is redirecting mortgages and loans away from African Americans. So even if you moved here, like in 2000, you would still benefit from the discrimination against African Americans. But more importantly, we're just redirecting the taxes from
Right.
from
It's
back.
a redirecting, right? But would you agree African Americans are a minority compared to the rest of the United States, right? Obviously, right? So when you take money from one thing that, like, say affirmative action, not even necessarily, but say affirmative action, that's benefiting everyone in the United States, and then you move it just specifically to African Americans, that means you're taking away from the rest of the groups in the United
No,
States.
you're not taking away from
Why are
the
you not
rest.
taking away?
Because you're benefiting African Americans and
So you're benefiting
wait,
one
let
group
me-
at the
okay,
expense
let me-
of others. Do you
let me-
concede
that's
that
the
that's
definition of a
immoral?
reparation. You have to hurt whites and benefit African Americans. That's literally the definition
You have to
of a
hurt
reparation.
whites.
Yes,
So
no, well not
the
right,
USFG has an obligation to hurt whites.
Please
Sorry.
let me explain
Go ahead.
myself, right? By hurting whites, I mean putting them on the same playing field. Like right now, whites have an unfair advantage over African Americans.
So
And when you put them on the same playing field, you're effectively hurting whites at
Right.
the expense of
But
African
the
Americans.
way-
And that's more important because you specifically target African Americans
Can I-
so they know we're legitimate
respond to that?
about paying reparations and genocide.
The difference is here, what you want to do, make the playing field level, that's completely fine. But reparations specifically would take the group from up top and group from down low and move it down like that.
Exactly,
You're,
that's exactly
you're
what we wanna
harming
do.
one group to hurt another, and
The-
given that blacks are the
the
minority
job- the
group,
job of the
there is a
14th
net
Amendment-
moral harm.
The job of the 14th Amendment is to ensure equal protection, and right now you just conceded that there's not equal protection. By putting them on the same same playing field,
The
we're
government has an
effectively-
obligation to benefit the most of its
Alright,
citizens. If
that's
it takes one down, that's immoral. Let's take a little bit of practice. Alright, 25 seconds more.
Students ready?
Yeah.
Pardon? Judges, so as an off-time roadmap, I will be going over the main issues in today's debate. So time starts now. Judges, I'd like to point out to you that our opponents think that this debate is about proving that we have a moral debt to help African Americans. This debate is not about that. This debate is about whether we have a moral debt to pay reparations to African Americans. I'd like to point out to you that reparations was not defined in their case, meaning that you must go with our definition of lump sum payments. Now let's talk about lump sum payments. They tell us that because the lottery effect is not specifically talking about reparations, you have to cross it off of your flow. However, the lottery effect says that in the case of reparations, if you give people money, they're not going to be able to use it properly, and they're going to put them into even more poverty. So what they're telling you about how you're going to raise one group to this standard and another group to this standard to make them equal is not going to happen. You're pushing this group even lower, and you're pushing the higher group even lower as well. There's no net gain. Now let's talk about social programs. Even if we do go with their case that talks about social programs, there's no way to distinguish between who's going to get the benefits and who's not. And this just causes reverse discrimination. How are you going to distinguish between someone who's full black and someone who's half black? How are you going to tell which person is going to get the reparations and which person is not? If you give it to one person and you don't give it to another, then it's just simply even more discrimination. This is why we must look to the feasibility argument. They bring you up this analogy about how if you have a disabled man, he still has a moral obligation to help a drowning child. This is simply wrong because a government is not a person. A government has a moral responsibility to take a utilitarianistic approach of helping more people than they harm. By paying reparations, we are harming more people than we help because, first of all, we are pushing black Americans even lower, and we're taking away from taxpayers' money who have absolutely no responsibility for this crime. Now let's talk about this legal obligation. My opponent brought up in his rebuttal speech that the 14th Amendment says that it is unconstitutional to pay reparations. And they tell you that this 14th Amendment is not enforced. Just because it is not enforced does not mean we don't have a legal obligation to do so. There's many things. In fact, slavery was illegal in some areas. Just because people didn't follow that rule doesn't mean we don't have a legal obligation to follow that rule. Now let's talk about the harm. They completely dropped the point about precluding precluding the opportunity for African Americans to get reparations in the future. By paying reparations, we're simply harming African Americans, and this is why I strongly urge a con ballot.
Alright, I'll take a little bit of running prep time starting now. Alright, that was 27 seconds, so we have 23 left.
You folks are keeping time for him, right?
Yeah.
So the first issue is going to be on government obligation. Now, they basically concede in the last speech that racism still occurs and that some people are violating the 14th Amendment by discriminating against African Americans. But remember that the very first obligation that a government has is to enforce its own laws and enforce its constitution. They concede that the 14th Amendment is being violated, and that becomes the government's obligation to pay reparation. Remember, the value of a reparation is bringing equal opportunity to both blacks and whites. At the point where they concede that African Americans do not have the same opportunity, you have to default to the pro because the government is violating its very first obligation, which is its legal obligations to uphold the Constitution. The second voter issue, the second reason you vote for the affirmative, is because our advocacy basically links out of their entire case. Now, one, we talk about direct cash transfers, and two, we talk about social mobility programs. We're not increasing taxes on the people because we're moving money from programs that they can see don't work into a program that will work. Now, remember, they say that racism still exists in the status quo. That means affirmative action and other programs like that didn't solve racism. That means we need a new program that actually does something to solve racism. That's where our advocacy comes in. You clean extend our impacts to our third argument, which go unresponded to in the rebuttal speech and the summary speech, where we tell you that social mobility programs, as in giving people loans and mortgages, decrease poverty by 33% and decrease racism by 4%. They say we need to talk about feasibility and give you concrete evidence. We're the only team that actually does that. We show you empirically that giving reparations actually solves the problem that they want to solve. Now remember, change the status quo and pay reparations. What you're effectively doing by paying reparations is breaking the cycle of complacency. Now they say that if we were to pay reparations, the government isn't going to feel any responsibility to do more things. Remember the example Anto gives you in a rebuttal speech. After the civil rights movement, the government didn't stop trying to help African Americans. We passed more laws like the Fair Housing Act and the Fair Employment Act. Passing one law to help African Americans does not preclude passing more laws. They never give you an historical example. The only historical example they give you is Asian Americans and say that Asian Americans couldn't sue the government for money. The fact is the government gave them the money in the first place. That's the only reason they couldn't get reparations. We legitimately did pay reparations to Asian Americans. That's why they don't face racism. We solve all the problems the negative shows. We should win this debate.
Okay. Can I have the first question?
Yeah, you guys.
Okay, so you said in your speech, the first moral duty of a government is to uphold its laws. So just think about Nazi Germany. Would it be moral for them to uphold their law of
Look, our laws are not to kill
Yeah,
millions of
well,
people.
sure, but just like this
It's
whole
like-
concept that a government's responsibility is first
Okay,
and
the
foremost.
14th
Like, why do we have
Amendment-
amendments, right? It's to
Like-
change laws. Clearly,
Okay,
laws
yeah,
aren't
but
the
we have to-
key,
alright,
the
listen.
winner here.
Listen, but the 14th Amendment is not even close to saying like Mein
Oh.
Kampf saying we need to
No, of
kill
course
all
I
Jews,
agree with
right?
that. Of course I
but
agree with that,
listen, 14th Amendment is a good law. If a good law is being violated,
So-
then we have a moral.
Several people during that time did not think that that law was a bad
Right.
law.
Yeah, during
So
that
you cannot
time,
use
and that's why we
logic
Okay,
as
so
just
are you
because it's
basically
a law. You have
you're comparing this to Nazism?
No,
We
no.
must look to
I'm
the-
comparing this specific example of the government's #1 responsibility morally to be upholding its laws. The reason we have amendments is because sometimes
Yeah.
laws aren't the moral
Okay, has
thing
the
to
14th
do.
Amendment been changed?
No, it hasn't, but it
Absolutely
wasn't
not,
there.
right?
There's a
no
reason it was
amendment to the
created,
14th
right?
Amendment.
Because
It's-
laws aren't the end all be
Yeah,
all.
so let me ask you a
14th
question.
Sure.
What would you change about the 14th Amendment?
I'm not saying I would change anything.
So then we should uphold
But
it, right?
just this whole idea that the first moral obligation of a government is to its laws, that's not true. I would say the
That is
first
true.
moral obligation is to
The
create
laws
a
are
good life
created.
for
Look,
its citizens.
the laws are created A, to benefit everybody. B, to make sure the government doesn't like violate people's laws, right? Violates people's rights, right? The government through laws is how they benefit people. So if the laws are being violated, then there can't be a benefit to people. That's the most important job of a government.
But are
Can we
you
ask a
telling me
question?
that?
Can we ask a question now?
Sure.
So why is it immoral to uphold the 14th Amendment?
No, I'm not saying it's immoral to uphold the 14th Amendment. What I'm saying is the first and foremost responsibility on the moral part of the USFG is to benefit the
Okay,
most
cool,
citizens
cool.
it can.
Okay, can I have
Thank
another
you.
question?
Yeah, go for it.
So at the top of your speech, you said that you're not advocating for solvency, correct?
That was
We
your
don't
first
have to- that was
observation.
the first-
You
we
don't,
don't
you don't
have
have
to.
to prove it, but
So
we
you
do
don't
it
have to
anyways.
prove solvency.
We're actually, like, if you look
Meaning
at
that reparations,
wait,
as
so let
long
me
as
finish, right? If you look at the flow, we're actually the only team that proves, like, actual, with
No, actually,
empirics that
your
reparations
only
No, 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 we
response to
proved
our
it.
affirmative action thing was that it didn't solve for racism.
You guys-
If you're not
you guys
even
agreed
advocating
that.
solvency, this falls under your
No,
case.
we're not
okay,
conceding that point at all.
Wait,
We're
wait,
saying
you
we're
guys are misconstruing what we said. In our
Alright.
observation, we said we didn't have to prove solvency to win the debate.
Exactly.
In our second,
right.
wait,
So
let me-
what?
Okay.
Wait, can I interpret that?
No,
Right.
no, no. But in our second and third argument, we do provide solvency. So you can't
Right,
say
right,
that.
but here, can I interpret that? So
Sure.
what you're saying is that if we attempt to clear the moral debt, even if it doesn't work, then it's fine.
But it
Then
will
why
work.
is affirmative action not a reparation in your
You
Under
guys,
your
you guys
definition.
or
define
not a
it as
reparation? Why is it
We
not
just-
clearing the moral
Yeah,
debt?
why doesn't it
because
clear?
it's not solving for racism.
Right,
It's
but you
not
just
doing-
said we don't need to
You
prove
guys are not
solvency.
solving.
Alright, look. So was the 14th Amendment effective?
And you tell me
No,
yes.
sorry,
I
not the
say so.
14th Amendment. Affirmative action, right? Affirmative action wasn't effective.
Right, it didn't solve racism entirely, but neither will changing the housing
Listen, but it didn't benefit only African Americans either, though, right?
Right,
Like,
and in that way it's an
exactly.
even
That's
better
what
way to
Anya
clear
and I
the
said.
USFG's
Okay,
moral
let
debt
me
to the
finish.
minority
Let me finish
groups
the
that
point
are
I'm making. We need to benefit specifically African Americans because if we don't do that, we're basically like ignoring the harms that we did to African Americans in the past. Like that's why stuff that just broadly benefits
at the
minorities.
detriment of other groups.
Yeah.
That's exactly what a reparation is. We have to lower whites and put blacks
Wait,
on the
what
same.
you
What
guys
about
did-
all the
okay,
other groups
question,
that
you
we
We
want?
paid reparations to
And
like
that's
Native
fine.
Americans and
That's fine.
Japanese.
Okay, we'll take the remainder of it. Okay. Alright. So we're going to start off with the morality feasibility debate, and then we're going to talk about two voter issues. You guys ready?
Yeah.
Pardon me, Judge? Okay. I'm going to prove to you in this speech why today, in 2015, reparations are not a good idea. Now let's first talk about this morality versus feasibility. These clearly are linked because of the word ought, which indicates morality and feasibility are together. I cannot hold someone to a moral standard that's impossible for them to actually carry through with. That's simply not fair. They try to consider them separately. They try to say, well, we only have to win morality. But we would say morality and feasibility are actually linked. So by winning feasibility, we'll link back to morality. We're winning that morality argument. Now let's talk about obligation. First, the United States federal government is fundamentally different than a person. While it would be immoral for a person to let a baby drown, if the USFG is in the case and there's 10 babies here to drown and one over here, it would be immoral for the USFG to go after the one and not save the 10. Morality is going to be a net thing here. The USFG needs to look at a cost-benefit analysis. The first obligation of the USFG is going to be to its people, not to its laws. The reason we have laws, the reason we have the 14th Amendment, is because at some point in the USFG's history, we realized the laws were not adequate, the laws are not solving. The only obligation is to its people. Harming more of its people than helping it is a completely immoral thing for the USFG to do. And then finally, taxpayers are simply not culpable for the harm the USFG is facing, the blacks are facing today. Taxpayers, 42 million immigrants, which is a sizable amount of the United States, were not even around. Their ancestors were not not even around, to perpetuate any of these harms against African Americans, you're going to vote on us because there's no obligation for the USFG. But finally, let's talk about the real world, second voter issue. Remember the lottery effect. They can see direct cash transfers. Suddenly throwing a bunch of money at a bunch of people that are in an impoverished state has been empirically proven not to work. We give you 2 examples of this. I can show you the evidence afterwards. They completely drop our point about political backlash, how actually implementing reparations would cause so much political backlash that it would undermine the efforts. And finally, the most important thing in this round is that it would preclude repair for slavery. They talk about things like housing reform. They say if we reform our housing policies now, then that's fine. That's not fine. Here's why. African Americans are going to eventually come back saying, we need reparations for more of the harms. Maybe in the future that would be okay. But since we pay them for housing now, we can't pay them later. The United States federal government absolves itself from actually paying in the future. And it happened with Japanese Americans. You're not solving for the problems of African Americans. Today is not the time for reparations. You vote nay. Thank you.
We'll take the remaining 23 seconds starting now. So just like a quick observation and 2 voting issues. All the judges ready? Alright, my time starts now. So starting with the quick observation. Now they just now tried to extend stuff like complacency, racial backlash, and stuff like that. But recognize they completely dropped the response that I gave you about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement benefited African Americans. There was a little bit of backlash, but in the long term, the government passed policies that benefited African Americans, like the Fair Housing Act and stuff like that, to ensure like free employment, stuff like that. And recognize that what the civil rights movement did was create discourse, was create positive impacts for African Americans, and in the future, it even passed more things. There's no historical examples to support this. They just talk about Japanese Americans, but we didn't pay anything else to Japanese Americans because they weren't discriminated against. Now let's go to the 2 voting issues. First, on the issue of like actually benefiting people through reparations. Recognize that they clean dropped that housing program thing that we've extended throughout the debate. When you give them social mobility programs through the forms of mortgages and loans, employment is decreased by 33%. They keep wanting to talk about direct cash transfers. Well, we've told them we're not only defending that, we're defending housing programs. That's where we're going to be winning the debate because we show a benefit to people who have been discriminated against in housing. We're the only team that gives actual empirics. Now they just say it's like the lottery, and they give data for the lottery in Florida. That's not the same thing as giving direct cash transfers or the social mobility programs that decrease racial resentment by 4%. Remember, you have to look at those impacts because they just simply did not respond to it. Now on to the issue of what an obligation actually is. Now they say the job of the government is to benefit its people. The way it does that is by passing legislation and by passing laws. The 14th Amendment was meant to benefit people. So is the Fair Housing Act. But if those laws are being violated, that means that people aren't being benefited. And by enforcing the 14th Amendment and by forcing the Fair Housing Act, you not only see a benefit to African Americans today, but that means that we've set a precedent for establishing law in the future. That means like if you want to impact minorities in the future, if something's being violated, we're going to look back on this and say the 14th Amendment and the Fair Housing Act are really important. Now that's where we're going to be winning the debate because they say the government must benefit people. It does that through enforcing law. Now they say 42 million immigrants would have to pay taxes. Remember, we're rerouting taxes. And for all these reasons, I strongly urge a vote for reparations. Thank you.
Okay, good job guys. So just one question. What's the 14th Amendment?
That all citizens will be protected equally.
Hey, after the round. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Good job. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good job guys, all 4 of you.
Thank you.
Sorry?
Oh, yeah. Or, the internet's not really working on mine, so.
Do you want to borrow mine?
Or, yeah, if you.
I don't
Yeah.
have a computer.
Yeah, just-
I'm on the top and the judges.
Are you guys planning on disclosing? I don't know. Is it,
Discuss
Elam's usually. Do
No, I don't plan to discuss.
No study.
you have any feedback for us? Let's go.
No, feedback, all of you did.